YGO Strats single card discussions, gonna be talking about some of the cards that have impacted Yu-Gi-Oh! Throughout the years. Or in the case of this video, one that didn't impact the game. Today's card, Konami's less than stellar Pot of Avarice replacement, Pot of Dichotomy. Pot of Dichotomy was first released in Shadow Specters in November of 2013. As of this video, the card has only received 2 reprints, first in the 2014 Megatins, and again in Legendary Decks 2 in 2016. From its release to this day, it has spent no time on the ban list, and I feel pretty confident saying it never will. A normal spell card, its effect reads: at the start of your main phase 1, target 3 monsters with different types in your graveyard. Shuffle all 3 into the deck, then draw 2 cards. You cannot conduct your battle phase the turn you activate this card. Pot of Dichotomy, the second of the fused pot cards and the only fused pot card that hasn't made an impact on the meta. I've done videos on the other 4 if you're interested in them, though I tell you only the videos on Desires and Dichotomy are worth watching because my older videos are, well, we'll just say older. Still, with thanks to the suggestion from KCS, I'm gonna go over why this is one that just didn't hold up compared to its cousins, as I'm gonna call them. Seriously, what even are these? Are these their spirits? Anyways. When Dichotomy was released, it was just 2 months after one of the biggest ban lists in this game's entire history, in no small part to the September 2013 ban lists being the official start of the divide between the TCG and the OCG. And for us here in the TCG, it was just 2 months after the banning of Pot of Avarice that would last just shy of 7 years. And this is a card that serves ultimately the same purpose: shuffle monsters from the grave back into the deck and then draw cards. Ultimately, it doesn't make sense to try and talk about this card without comparing it to Pot of Avarice. Avarice is not only one of the 2 cards that this pot is fused from, but also it's quite literally the same effects, but with a few tweaks and more restrictions. Avarice can be played in any deck that plays monsters, which has got to be about 99% of decks that aren't FTKs or just a gimmick deck on Master Duel. And while Dichotomy can be played in any deck with monsters as well, technically, it needs to have 3 different types, which immediately restricts it from as wide of play as Avarice can see. Sure, decks like Wind Up or Dino Rabbit, or more modern things like Tri Brigade or anything that can play danger monsters can make use of this card regardless of that restriction. There are just as many decks that can't though. Fire Fist or Inzektor at this card's release, or more modern decks like Sky Striker or Zodiac, are all decks that would enjoy recycling monsters into the main deck or extra, but they're all monotype decks. It also is locked to being activated at the start of the main phase, meaning that if it isn't your draw for turn, it's not something you really want to see. Getting it off of Duality or any other sort of card means it's a dead card for the rest of the turn, and not getting a battle phase is a pretty big ask in a game where the overwhelming majority of games are decided in the battle phase. The only other cards that come to mind in regards to giving up your battle phase that I've ever seen play are things like Soul Charge, which is an insanely good effect in exchange for no battle phase, or something like Molten Glacia, which is both a niche card that is only seen play in like 1 competitive deck, and honestly isn't always a guaranteed loss of your battle phase since you can keep Molten Glacia on field and not suffer the consequences provided you win before it leaves. Which, for those 2, it's either one of the best effects in the entire game in my opinion, or at least a legal version of a banned card's effect in exchange for your battle phase, whereas with Pot of Dichotomy, you get the Walmart brand Pot of Avarice. It's a bit of a disparity in terms of the trade-off of effects there. It's not true to say that the card saw no success in competitive Yu-Gi-Oh!, as it did see use in 1 deck that would top consistently. Hand Artifact Trap Tricks, or HAT as it's known, would often play 1 copy of this, just the 1, as the hands were an integral part of the strategy and recycling them meant the deck could continue to play. And as one of Yu-Gi-Oh's best MUT decks, it had more than enough different types in its 3 engines to make this always live. Still, it was played at no more than 1 since you'd most likely get it off of a duality and then be using it on the follow-up turn, and the deck's control nature meant that no battle phase was fine in exchange for more destruction with hands or disruption with things like the artifacts. I also do want to mention that one guy topped German Nationals in 2014 playing a copy of this card in Frog Monarchs, which is just the peak of Sigma male energy. Still, once Duelist Alliance came out and power crept the meta, this card would disappear from deck lists pretty much entirely, with only 2 recorded tops playing it after Duelist Alliance dropped. And that's because it ultimately met the same fate that Pot of Avarice has met today, just it's way worse. Avarice sees little to no play in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Because as the game sped up, Avarice just became too slow. Boards are more about putting up negates, or disruption, or untouchable bosses that the opponent can't break, or trying to break a board with negates and disruption and untouchable bosses. And whichever one you're trying to go for, you'll need each and every one of the cards in your hand more often than not, and they need to be live and useful on your first turn. And Avarice just isn't, at least not reliably enough. Sure, maybe Zodiac can get it off going first after going through half of their extra deck each and every turn, but that's one deck and that's a maybe. If you want to draw, there's cards like Extravagance or Desires, and if the duel goes your way, you probably won't need to be recycling your cards because you'll already have the game on lock by that time, or if not, you've probably already lost whether or not you've conceded. And all of that applies to Avarice as much as it does to Dichotomy. Even with modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Having plenty of different typed hand traps, giving decks more than enough types to be able to use this card, it just doesn't do enough to warrant play. Plus, this card is literally dead on the first turn, being unplayable in 99.9% of games on the first turn, and the only time I can think of it being live is when you've been hand looped in some way, and at that point, Yu-Gi-Oh! Is unplayable, let alone this card specifically. With Avarice's return to the TCG as of January 2020, this card's fate has been sealed. In every way, this card is just a lackluster Avarice, unless you want to argue that it's better in the sense that it only needs 3 targets to be live in the grave instead of 5, but there is a term for what causes that type of argument, and that term is copium. Overall, Dichotomy is the first, and as of this video, the only failed fused pot spell, one whose multiple restrictions for its watered down effect kept it from being splashable, one whose late game nature meant it couldn't keep up with Yu-Gi-Oh's faster metagames, and one whose purpose as an alternative to a card on the ban list was erased by said card coming off the ban list. And so that's our look at single card disappointments, Pot of Dichotomy. Stay tuned for our next video and feel free to suggest some cards to review or what type of video you'd like to see. Don't forget to like and, as always, subscribe to YGO Strats so you too can become a true duelist.